Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. On October 16th, the world was shocked to learn that Israel's most wanted man and the architect of last year's October 7th attacks was killed by an Israeli Defense Forces infantry unit. Yahya Sinwar's death was a central goal of the Israeli war effort, and it marks a significant turning point for Hamas's leadership, hostage negotiations, and for Palestinian society at large. Sinwar wasn't just another Hamas leader. Known as the Butcher of Khan Yunis long before October the 7th, his brutality towards both Israelis and Palestinians alike made him infamous. His death represents a major victory for Israel. But the real question is, what will it mean for the future of Hamas and the ongoing conflict? Many prominent Hamas leaders, including Ismail Haniyeh and Mohammed Deif, have also been killed in recent months. But Sinwar's death feels like a potential shift in the trajectory of the war and hostage negotiations, for better or for worse. To help us unpack what this means, I'm joined by two experts, Ghaith al-Omari and Dr. Michael Milshtein. Ghaith is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute and former executive director for the American Task Force on Palestine. He also served as an advisor to the Palestinian Authority negotiating team during the 1999 and 2001 permanent status talks, among other roles he held within the PA in those years and in subsequent ones. Dr. Michael Milshtein is an expert on the Palestinian arena and heads the Palestinian Studies Forum at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. He previously served as an advisor on Palestinian affairs for a key wing of the IDF that is the liaison with Palestinian civilian population. And he also served as the head of the Department on Palestinian Affairs in IDF Military Intelligence. Ghaith and Michael, I want to welcome you both to Decision Points.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having us.
Well, we got a lot to talk about, and you are two big experts on the Palestinian issue and on Hamas itself. The events in the Middle East are going at such a rapid pace. It's hard for us to digest, what has been done, what has developed, and what are the implications. So we want this show to look at really Hamas after Sinwar. I want to understand just first about Sinwar himself, Yahya Sinwar, who was killed in Gaza. I want to understand how he rose to prominence as a leader. Did he inspire people, or was it just due to brutal tactics? He was known as someone who killed Palestinians for suspected collaboration with Israel. And did he just rule through fear? Or was it connected to Iranian backing for him and the military wing of Hamas? In other words, how did he become the leader that he became? So, Ghaith, maybe we'll start with you.
He built his strength, credibility, his leadership over many years, ticking all the necessary boxes to become such a leader. Coming from the military wing of Hamas, where, as you alluded to, he was in charge of what they call internal security, which is counter-espionage. Basically, if you're suspected without necessarily any proof of being a collaborator, he will deal with you in the most brutal way. Then from that, he moved to ticking the next box, which is being a leader in the Hamas prisoner movement, which is a key constituency of Hamas. Once he was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, then he started ticking the political box, coming to lead Hamas in Gaza, and ultimately he oversaw the transition of the center of gravity of Hamas from the diaspora, where it had been since many years, to becoming in Gaza. So he ticked all of these boxes. He was someone who had credibility with both the military and political wing. October 7th gave him an additional layer of not only credibility, I would even say mythical standing within the Hamas cadre at least. October 7th is still seen as an act of initiative by Hamas, and he was in charge of it. So he managed to tick all these boxes, and I would argue today there are not many who can tick all of these boxes. You don't do this overnight. One last quick footnote on Iran. Yes, he was part of the shift of Hamas back to the Iranian orbit, particularly after the crisis they had after Hamas left Syria. Yet he also was someone who tried to maintain relations with the Egyptians and with others. So he basically played the different constituencies, internal and external, for Hamas.
And Michael, how do you see it?
First of all, I really agree with the broad analysis of Reith. I just want to add a different aspect. As every ideological dictator, the question of power and the question of position, it's not only a result of the fact that people are afraid if you use all kind of brutal manner, but also that you yourself as a figure, you symbolize ideas and you symbolize all kind of broad phenomena among your society. When we speak about Yahya Sinwar, Abu Ibrahim, of course, he was one of the founders of Al-Majd organization, which was the unit inside the military wing that was responsible to find and to execute collaborators. But in the same time, and I agree at this point with Reith, Yahya Sinwar was also a member of the refugees sector in Gaza. As many, actually almost all Hamas members and leaders in Gaza Strip, he actually, in his figure, he symbolized mobilization and he symbolized the revolutionary kind of a social revolution. And I think that when we speak about Yahya Sinwar, he was also a symbol. Of course, mentioned that he was a symbol of the prisoners' movement. He spent 23 years in Israeli jail. He was one of the founders of the military wing of Hamas, and he held a very, not unique, let's call it a very prominent or special opinion regarding the future. In contrary to leaders like Ismail Haniyeh or Khaled Mashal, who were very much focused on political activities or even social public activities, Yahya Sinwar, he held the slogan of jihad right now. And I think that many Palestinians, mainly the young generation, they were very much, and they are still very much, affiliated with this figure and these ideas. So I want to argue that Yahya Sinwar was not only a figure, a leader that you can admire, he actually symbolized a lot of broad, deep social, intellectual, political phenomena inside the Palestinian arena.
Michael, what do you think is his self-image? Do you think he saw himself as a modern Salah ad-Din, that he was going to liberate the Palestinians? There was this quote in the Wall Street Journal, I think, that came out of Israel, or of his communications, saying, okay, so many Palestinians will die, so Gaza will be destroyed, but that's just the way it is. People are going to have to suffer for this. He didn't really think that he was building a Palestinian society, but he will go down in the history books as the person who defeated the modern day crusaders in his mind. I'm just trying to think how he saw himself.
And it is a very complicated mission, David, because you need to get inside the head of a radical religious ideological leader. And sometimes when we analyze, the Western people, when we analyze these kind of leaders, we actually impose our patterns of thinking on them. I'm trying to analyze how Yahya Sinwar considered himself. Yes, I think that he considered himself as the new Salah ad-Din. When I'm trying to analyze what was actually the basic background or the basic reason for October 7th, at this point, I must say that it seems that he was not a crazy leader. Many people here in Israel, they consider him as a crazy people disconnected from reality. Not at all.
We hear the word sociopath. The cabinet minister said to me, in the cabinet, the intel people kept saying he's a sociopath.
Absolutely. And by the way, by saying that, it's a very easy thing to say for an analyst, because you don't need any reason to really to analyze his logic. And I think that on October 7th, he was realistic enough to understand that he will not defeat Israel. He spent 23 years in Israeli jail. He was one of the very few Palestinian leaders who knew Hebrew, who read Israeli media. And he didn't want really, he understood that he will not wave the green flag of Hamas over Al-Aqsa in this day. But he wanted to achieve another goals. For example, he wanted to undermine the basic confidence of the Israeli society. He wanted to create alienation between the society and the regime, and between groups inside the society. And most important, he wanted to create deep hostility between the two communities, the Palestinian and the Israelis. So no one could for a long time speak about any kind of political settlement between the two peoples. I think that when you're asking a religious, ideological leader, do you now regret what you did? For example, when you see that there are so many casualties and such a broad destruction, they will never say that they regret, because this is God's will, and you cannot really reject God's will. I think that right now you cannot ask Yahya Sinwar about what he wanted, but I think that when you will ask many people in his beehive, those who survived, about his heritage, his will, I'm quite sure that they will say that, yeah, we will continue his goal of jihad.
Ghaith, can I just ask you, Sinwar's relations with the Arab states? Did he think that he would stop the train of Saudi-Israeli normalization? Did he have a political objective beyond a historical sense of mission, a religious sense of mission?
First of all, just to add to what Michael said, in addition to using religious symbolism, and actually, he did that at Hamas in general, when they talk about October 7th and the death and destruction, they also locate it within the kind of liberation narrative. And so they refer to, for example, the Algerian revolt that had, a million casualties, etc. So they're not only trying to appeal. Yes, the foundation is religious, but they're also trying to appeal to constituencies which are not religious by placing it in the kind of non-religious secular liberation narrative. Now, in terms of his Arab relations, first of all, there's no doubt that the Saudi normalization was part of the thinking of the Hamas collective. Not necessarily Sinwar himself, but you look at some of the minutes of meetings that were passed to some of the media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and you see that Hamas was very aware of that. That said, Sinwar actually played a very clever game. In the same way that he managed to convince the Israelis that he is deterred, that he's willing to play this game of carrots and sticks, etc., he also convinced the Arabs of the same. If you would talk to Egyptian intelligence, for example, a year or 2 years ago, you would have heard the exact same analysis you would have heard from Israeli intelligence folks. Yes, Sinwar is deterred. With some economic goodies and with some pressure, we'll get him to act how we want him to act. So he managed to kind of sell this narrative to everyone. So it was not only Israel that was taken off guard on October 7th. It was a lot of the kind of Arab milieu that thought that Gaza was contained. And by the way, this is part, as we think of the future, of deepening the mistrust between Hamas and the Arab governments, some of whom thought you can co-opt those guys, but now realizing, as Michael said, with religious fanatics, they tend to operate and think in ways that are very different from our own calculations.
We talk about the conceptia, the kind of governing set of assumptions that got October 7th wrong. You're saying, Ghaith, that really he also fooled the Arabs. He fooled the Egyptians who thought they could invite him to Cairo, show him the good life. He never left Gaza. He'd spent a lot of his time in Israeli jail. They could co-opt him in some ways, and yet you're saying he fooled the Egyptians no less than he fooled Israel.
By the way, just to be fair, he fooled all of us because that was also the governing concept in the DC policy community.
Michael, do you have a thought on this?
Regarding Ghaith analysis, it's quite amazing because when you speak about Israelis, even Israeli intelligence, you can say, yeah, here in Israel, we didn't understand correct Hamas. Many of us do not understand what is Muslim Brotherhood vision. Many of us do not read or understand Arabic. But when you speak about the Egyptians, you cannot be naive and say they do not understand what is Muslim Brotherhood. But I really agree with Ghaith. Actually, there were joint mistakes of both Israelis and Egyptians regarding Sinwar. It seems that the sources of these mistakes, of this misconception, was first of all the mixture between wishful thinking and assessment. It was very prominent among the Israeli decision makers and among the Israeli intelligence, but also among the Egyptians. And the fact that, here in Israel and also in Egypt, we understood that we don't have really a lot of alternatives. Any kind of Arab control over Gaza, it is not likely. So we have to rely on Sinwar and to believe, not to assess, to believe that, maybe he will be contained and maybe in a gradual manner, he even will be changed. And this was a mistake, of course.
For Egypt, it's even less understandable because the Muslim Brotherhood are their main opponent. And he is the Muslim Brotherhood, head of Gaza. So they misread him. It says something wider. But Michael, if you could just tell us a little bit, if there's any nuggets you can add as we close off the Sinwar part and we go to post-Sinwar, can you give us a sense of the fact that he was not in a tunnel? There was no human shields around him. There's been some speculation that the 6 hostages that were killed in the tunnel was ordered by Sinwar himself because he found that they were not useful to him anymore, that he needed to be nimble, and Israeli satellites would pick up if suddenly 7 people, 6 plus Sinwar, and then maybe bodyguards, so more than 7, are all walking in a tight cluster together, and that he felt he needed more flexibility, fluidity. Do we know if he was outside the tunnel systems for a while? What do we know more about the lead up to the death? I mean, the troops that killed him have said, look, we didn't know we killed him. It was a coincidence. It was not special forces. It was a training group of corporals that saw something suspicious. They did not know who they had until after the fact, and then they realized who it was. It wasn't maybe even the same unit that discovered it. Is there any more details surrounding the run-up? How long do we think he was out of the tunnels? Do we think he was the one that gave the order to execute the 6 like Hirsch, Goldberg, Poland?
It seems that at least right now, David, we don't have any more detailed information about what happened and why Sinwar was outside of the tunnels and why he was almost alone in Tel Sultan, nearby Rafah. But, there is another point that I speak a lot about in the Israeli discourse, and this is the gap or the difference between the Israeli discourse and the Palestinian one. Because, here in Israel, after the event of 2 weeks ago, there are many people here in Israel who describe Sinwar as a scared rat running out of the tunnels, that his death was a very humiliating event. We must be very cautious. We don't really understand what was his basic patterns and what was his basic behavior. I don't assess that it was the first time that he got out of the tunnels. I think that, for a lot of months, this was his basic behavior. And second, we must be aware that our description, the Israeli one, is not the Palestinian one. The photos that were released, and I think that it was a mistake of IDF spokesman to release those photos, he was shown in those photos with rifle, AK-47, with uniforms, with kafia, and in the Arab, Palestinian, and the Muslim discourse, he became a hero. It was not a humiliating death as it was described in the Israeli media and the Israeli politics, but a heroic moment. I'm not sure that, we can describe this whole event as the most horrible crisis of Hamas.
You agree, Ghaith, that he's going to loom large in death as he did in life?
He is looming large. He's not going to. It's happening already. If you look at some of the Arab media, and particularly the Hamas amplifiers like Al Jazeera, first of all, the image of him throwing a stick at the drone has become iconic. You've seen even people kind of reenacting that and doing art installation about it. Honestly, you look at some of the AI-generated images in Al Jazeera and elsewhere, you think this guy looks like something out of an action movie, etc. So I agree actually with Michael. The release of the images might have worked for an Israeli audience. It just amplified his image as someone who fought to the last second and reinforces that.
How do you assess, Michael, may I start with you? Just how do you assess Hamas's capabilities? Israel says, look, there were like 24 brigades of Hamas and they've been broken up over this war. They are not an army anymore. They're a guerrilla. There are pockets of resistance and the insurgency is beginning in Jabalia, maybe in certain places, because Israel is not doing what David Petraeus says, which is clear, hold to build. But just in terms of their capacity, how diminished are they? And then we could see, can they revive?
This is the kind of questions, David, that once again maybe reflect sometimes the gaps between our conception and the other side, the reality or conception. There is no doubt that Hamas suffered unprecedented damage since October 7th in the military and in the governmental, in the civil levels. And when you check, for example, the military level, it is not the same movement. We speak about between 20 to 25,000 members of the military wing that were killed. A lot of senior figures, senior commanders, including Mohammed Deif and Marwan Issa, and of course, Yahya Sinwar. I assess that most of the rockets arsenal of Hamas was destroyed and many other military infrastructures. Once again, we cannot speak about Hamas as the regime they were a year ago. But, and this is a very important point, we speak about a movement with a very unique organizational DNA. They can adjust very quickly to all kinds of changes and new conditions. And for example, in the military level, okay, you mentioned There are no more 24 brigades. They were all defeated. But Hamas actually turned to more limited and to smaller units and frames, acts according guerrilla patterns, urban guerrilla patterns, and already recruited new members from the refugee camps in Gaza, new commanders. And actually, there is no place today in Gaza that there is no fighting. You know, in every place that IDF once again gets in, for example, Jabalia, right now, there are very tough fighting. And in the civil aspect, Hamas actually uses proxies in order to preserve its sovereignty. For example, we cannot send policemen with uniforms, so we will send policemen with civil clothes. And we will be the one who arrange Friday pranks, and we will use charity funds and municipalities. And you know, it's sometimes very difficult for us to understand. But right now, in Gaza, there is no chaos. There is only one prominent player, and this is Hamas, by using a very tricky methods.
Ghaith and I, both in Washington and visiting campuses, we sometimes feel that, and I don't want to get all into Israeli politics because that'll take us in a whole different direction, but there's not always an appreciation in the U.S. and in different parts of the world that the fighting is a small fraction of what it was when Israel had 360,000 reservists last year after October the 7th. There's this fighting in different pockets in different places, but in terms of orders of magnitude, Israel has relatively few soldiers in Gaza. I do wonder, you're going to say, oh, this is a BB question. I don't really want to get into all that. But if someone like Defense Minister Gallant, and you worked at COGAT, you know, you were in the IDF system, the Israel Defense Forces system, you know, would say, listen, we don't have major operations in Gaza, but there are these pockets, we're trying to deal with it. Give a sense of proportionality to the world that this is not the level of fighting that existed before. And it might also be a signal to the Israeli people, too.
I agree with you. It's a total different world, David. But in the same time, we must also mention that right now, IDF is deployed in a very narrow places, territorial places in Gaza. IDF do not control all Gaza Strip. By the way, the one who really controls all the Palestinian society in Gaza is Hamas. IDF only controls Philadelphia, the borderline between Gaza and Sinai, and the area of Netzarim, and right now also Jabalia.
Netzarim corridor is parallel to what we call Wadi Gaza, the Gaza River, in the, let's say, the top third northern part of Gaza. And it's something that Israel has insisted upon and controlling in order to vet who goes back up to the north. Israel wants very few people there. This is a point of contention with the U.S. And in terms of what food is getting into the north, because most and almost all of Gazans are in the south, but there's still 300,000, the UN says a bit more, in northern Gaza. So Netzarim is connected to that northern Gazan question. About 2 million are in the south. Ghaith, let me go to you, and that is, I want you to give us some sense of Mohammed Sinwar. All we know is he's the younger brother of Yahya Sinwar. We know that he was very much involved in the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli corporal, in 2006. Israel ultimately traded, I think, 1,027 prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar himself, for this one corporal, Shalit. This is what got his brother Yahya out of prison. The Yahya Sinwar was so against this deal, they had to put him in solitary confinement. He was so much of an extremist. But the question is, can the younger brother, does he have the ambitions of his older brother? You know, as you said, you can't be a leader overnight. There are all sorts of layers and layers of foundation that go into this. Do we think he even wants to play this role? And the reason why, for our listeners, we care about this is because Israel has killed many of the military wing people. They've killed Mohammed Deif, who's supposedly the military mastermind, someone Israel's tried to kill at least like 7 other times, and that only elevated him. Marwan Issa, the person who was like the Hamas chief of staff, is killed. Hania, sitting in Qatar, was famously killed in Iran. Is he the main hope of the military wing as a leader? Is that realistic? Or are they a counterweight, the military wing under Mohammed Sinwar? Is he the guy to look to? Or is the military wing after Yahya Sinwar not relevant for the big decisions? We understand Hamas said there'll be an election in a year from now or something, but decisions have to be taken now. So how do you see it, Rafe?
I see what's happening right now. We've seen it in the past in the U.S. operations in Iraq, where the military side, defeating the military, was actually the easier part of the war. And the fact that there are limited operations right now with a vacuum in Gaza means that this is what's creating the space for Hamas to reconstitute. And this is exactly what happened in Iraq. And it took the surge to really defeat the insurgents in Iraq. And I suspect we're in a similar place. And unless you have someone, whether it is the Israelis, whether it's another force come in, then we are creating the space by letting off the pressure for Hamas to reconstitute. On Mohammed Sinwar, I can't get into his head, but everything that he has done so far indicates that he has the ambition. What I doubt is that he has the ability to do it. As you mentioned, the building leadership does not happen overnight. Simply having the title doesn't give you the gravitas. Yes, he might be there in the chain of command, but he doesn't have the standing within the total organization to assert himself in the same way that his brother asserted himself. I think, as Michael mentioned, it is not only that Sinwar had the internal weight, he was seen on the national Palestinian level as a leader that you cannot ignore. And when he spoke, other political leaders were afraid to contradict him. Mohammed Sinwar is not there, is not at that level in terms of his image, in terms of his networks. And I would add that even within the military wing, he has competitors. In northern Gaza, there's someone called Azadin al-Haddad, who's also quite strong there, because, as you both mentioned, the top tier of the military wing has been decimated. It means that Mohammed Sinwar comes in without that weight, without these relationships, without that history, and therefore I don't see him. I mean, the military wing is not over, and it will continue controlling both the operations on the ground, but as importantly, the hostages. Yet, in terms of the big decision-making, I don't see them having the ability when it comes to kind of head-to-head clashes with the big names like Mish'al, etc., or for that matter, like al-Hayya. I don't see them able to assert the same kind of control, the same veto power, the same ability to shape the strategic direction as Yahya Sinwar had.
I mean, it suggests that there is a vacuum. And Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, kind of also said that on his trip to the Middle East, that you have to seize the moment. If that vacuum is there, is this a moment for the Qataris to lean heavily on people like Khalil al-Hayya, who's really, even though people talked about Haniya, it seems like he was the real negotiator in Doha on the hostages. And then Mashal is there. There's a guy trying to replace Aruri in Beirut. Jubrin, I believe is his name. Is there a moment here, or is it like Netanyahu said, apparently there was an audio at the Likud faction meeting in the Knesset this week where he said, I'm concerned that anyone who wants to emerge wants to sound tough and sound that he's more Sinwar than Sinwar. Is there a moment here for the external wing? Are they more amenable to Qatari and others to say, okay, it's enough. It's just enough. We have to end it. We have to do a deal, let the hostages go. Maybe we won't do it all at once. It will be in phases, but we have to bring this to an end. Rafe, how do you see it?
First of all, I have to start with a caveat. We'll be talking now about military wing and political wing and internal and external and all of that. I want to make it very clear. Every member of the Hamas leadership and the organization are extremists. There are no moderates in that organization. Everyone endorsed and continues to endorse October 7th. You will see it by the statements of the most quote-unquote moderates. I would urge people to listen to what Khalid Mish'al, the most reasonable quote-unquote person said just a few days ago. They're still trying to agitate not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but even in places like Jordan and elsewhere. So I think this caveat is important. Now, if you talk about the external leadership of Hamas, certainly it's more vulnerable to external pressure for very practical reasons. They live in Qatar. They're under Qatari control, or surveillance at least, etc. So of course they are more reasonable. Yet I would say that the leadership landscape in the external leadership is still contested. Hamas is operating not only in an internal context, but also in an external context. In the external leadership, there are trends. There are those who want to have strong relations with Iran. There are those who want to pivot closer to the kind of Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni Arab orbit. And right now, it's not clear who has emerged as a leader within the external leadership. I think many of them are waiting to see where does the Iran-Israel dynamic go? Where does the Israel-Hezbollah dynamic go? So today, Iran axis is maybe symbolized by Khalil al-Hayya, whose power, frankly, was to a large extent derivative from Sinwar. So it'll be interesting to see in coming days whether he maintains that kind of power. I think it's too early to tell where the center of gravity is in the external leadership. I do believe that in general, it moved there, but it's not clear to me what the direction of the external leadership is. My gut feeling, though, is that as Iran and its axis continues to get bigger blows, especially in terms of Hezbollah, I suspect the Iranian-oriented axis will be weakened, the Muslim Brotherhood-oriented axis will be strengthened, and that might create a space for diplomacy, yet, and I would caution, and I will finish on this point, they would still try to get a hostage deal that's favorable to Hamas. And I'll be very wary of Qatari and Turkish, but Qatari in particular, mediation that might push for a deal that will give Hamas enough political goodies to be able to declare some sort of victory after that.
So, Michael, I certainly take Ghaith's point that if you're joining Hamas, you're not joining as a moderate. You believe that violence is the way to eliminate Israel. I assume all these Arab states have different calculations, and maybe some say, you know what, Iran wants to dominate, let them dominate. We don't want to have a relationship with these people. The UAE sees them all clearly as Muslim Brotherhood, and no one good could come of this. What is the calculations of the Arab states in terms of trying to press Hamas's external wing to end this war? Are there differences, and does it relate to whether they want to see Hamas in the Iranian orbit or in the Arab orbit? Are there differences among the Arabs?
First of all, with your permission, David, I want just to refer to the issue of the deal of the hostages, because this is really, many of the Israelis, I hope that the majority of the Israelis consider this issue as number one issue today in Israel. And, you mentioned that Netanyahu announced, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, that the current Sinwar is not very much different from the former one. And, basically, he's right, I mean Netanyahu, because when you check, as Ghaith described, Muhammad Sinwar, his basic opinions also regarding the deal are not different from Yahya's opinions. But I do think that there is a change right now in the basic frame of the decision-making in Hamas. And this is, of course, the fact that right now it seems that the political and the strategic decisions, the impact of the outside leadership, mainly Khalil al-Hayya, Sinwar's deputy in the past, or maybe other leaders, will be bigger. I will describe it in a very cautious manner. I think that maybe because of the leverage of Qatar, because of the fact that these leaders like Khalil al-Hayya, Khaled Mash'al, Musa Abu Marzouk and others, they live in Qatar, in Doha, so maybe Qatar will be able to promote more effective pressure on Hamas, and maybe we will see more flexible opinions regarding several points. For example, the timing of the implementation of the deal, the number of prisoners that Hamas demands, and other issues. But, and this is a very important point because many in Israel, I feel that they do not understand, there are also red lines from the outside leadership point of view. I mean, okay, they can be more flexible than Yahya Sinwar, but they won't say that they will agree to the Israeli demand to stay in Gaza itself, in those two corridors that we mentioned before, Netzarim and Philadelphia, during any period. Even if this leadership of the outside will be more flexible in several points, it will not accept this Israeli demand. And I assess that even leaders like Khalil al-Hayya and like Khaled Mash'al, they will be ready to continue the fighting, and they will be ready for more destruction and more casualties, but they will not wave a white flag, and they will not accept Israeli presence in Gaza in the day after. Regarding the external players, and once again, I agree with Ghaith at this point, it seems that Qatar, mainly because of the fact that almost all the prominent leaders of Hamas right now, they live in Doha, I think that Qatar will be more powerful or with more impact on the decision-making of Hamas. I do assess that maybe Iran, after Sinwar's death, will be less effective with less influence on Hamas. And all the other players, mainly Egypt, I think that there will be no dramatic change. For example, that Egypt, if Cairo wants to be very influential in the broad picture, there must be a coordination, a cooperation between Egypt and Qatar, and of course Israel, and they cannot, promote any kind of independent initiative. I assess that in the coming weeks, we will see more influential role of Qatar and maybe less impact of Tehran.
For our listeners who don't follow every detail, maybe, the big conceptual divide, it seems to me, over the phases of the hostages' release has been Netanyahu does not want to accept the idea of withdrawal from Gaza now. He's saying, first we'll do phase one, which is what the U.S. and Egypt and Qatar had discussed, to be fair. A third of the hostages, whoever's alive, among them including some who are not alive, will release a third now. And then we'll get to phase two and we'll discuss the issue of full withdrawal. But we don't want to discuss it right now. Are you saying that unless there's a commitment to full withdrawal, you don't see the Qatari influence, even if they want to keep America happy, which we keep thinking Qatar wants to keep America happy, you don't think Qatar is going to be able to impose this, even on the external wing?
I actually think that Qatar has no interest to impose such a demand on Hamas. I think that Hamas and Qatar, they both want to see IDF out of Gaza in the day after. And of course, also Qatar wants to see Hamas as the prominent player in Gaza, even if there will be all kind of cosmetic political changes in Gaza. I think that right now, Netanyahu's doctrine, which says that we will promote more and more pressure, more and more power, and then we will make Hamas to be more flexible, I'm not sure that it works. You can make them discuss about withdrawal maybe in the second phase of the deal, but you cannot make them accept Israeli long-term presence in Gaza. And I think that if you, Netanyahu, if you demand and you insist on this point, it means that there will be no deal. And I think that many Israelis do understand today that this is the tough, the painful choice that must be done, because there are no good alternatives over here, only problematic alternatives.
No, I think it was understood in the deal that the U.S. was trying to broker that second phase was about withdrawal. And I don't think Israel even disputed that. But the question was, would we get to a second phase where Hamas is always saying, no, we want you to, ideally do it in one phase, but we want that you commit to withdrawal now, up front. Let me just ask Ghaith here, do you see that Qatar, from what we hear, that Qatar knows it is a small state. Yes, its niche is trying to be the link to the bad guys, as one of the Qatari officials told me, but they also want to keep the U.S. happy. Is this a chance for the U.S. to press Qatar more so it can press the external wing more, in your view?
I have no problem with a country being a link to the bad guys. We need those kind of countries. My problem with Qatar is that it is also an amplifier and a supporter of the bad guys. That's very different. And I think as the U.S. leans on Qatar, it should lean on it both to be effective, but also lean on it to change its fundamental support for Hamas. A deal would require Qatar and Egypt. Qatar because the leaders live there, Egypt because of its geography and the fact that it's Egypt. And while those countries are working together now to get a deal, their strategic interests are very different. Qatar wants a deal that basically allows Hamas to emerge strong and intact politically. Egypt wants a deal that ultimately strategically weakens Hamas. And I think in the US, we need to be aware of these nuances. In the medium term, I would also take a close look on Saudi Arabia. We know for a fact that Khalid Mashal, the leader of the Hamas external wing, has for many years been trying to make overtures to the Saudis. So far, they have been rebuffed. As Saudi plays a more vigorous role, a more robust role, it would be interesting to see whether or not it's willing to engage with the political wing of Hamas, move it away from the Iranian axis. This is not an immediate question. This is a medium-term question, but I would certainly guarantee you that Mish'al and the external leadership will try to get on board with the Saudis, and it'd be very interesting to see how the Saudis are going to act that way.
What could be done to ensure that Hamas does not regain its previous, certainly its military dominance in Gaza? I said before, to defeat Hamas, you have to compete with Hamas. We could do a whole episode on the day after in Gaza. But for our purposes here, what is the influence of external forces in the Arab world and in Israel too, and the Palestinian Authority? How do you shape the dynamics in the aftermath of Sinwar's death and Hamas's weakened state? Who's got the interest? And Ghaith, you grew up in Jordan. Jordan is going through some tough times here in terms of the role of the Islamic Action Front in the Jordanian parliament. Do they feel that you contain Hamas by dealing with Hamas? Bob Woodward's book, the new book that came out, War, there's a section of Blinken, the Secretary of State, talking to King Abdullah. After October 7th, the king says, I kicked them out of Jordan. You have to defeat these people. And he goes to the UAE, Blinken, and he says, you have to go after all these people, Hamas. They have to be defeated. Now, these are things the Arab leaders don't say publicly, but they come out in Bob Woodward's book. How did the Arab leaders see their role in ensuring Hamas does not grow back to what it was? How do you see it, Rafe?
There is no doubt that all of these Arab leaders think of Hamas as a threat, as an enemy, as a problematic actor. More so after October 7th, where many of the countries who felt they were insulated from the developments in the Palestinian arena felt that that came to bite them in the backside, as it were, like the Saudis, etc., who look at Hamas. Hamas is always calling for Arabs to come in and support Hamas, etc., in Gaza. And the refrain you often hear, even publicly, is, wait a minute, you did not consult with us when you went into the war. Now you want us to pay the price of the war. So that's all of that is out there. Yet those leaders have to deal with publics that support October 7th, where Hamas is popular, and they have to manage that. So I give you an example, a country like Jordan. I know within the establishment in Jordan, and that includes the security establishment and the conservative establishment, there's a debate. Do you ride the wave? And if you're riding the wave, are you feeding the wave? I think in Jordan, some were saying, and we saw that over the last year, let's have a rhetoric that is strong, that is fiery, that even in some ways mirrors Hamas rhetoric. What's the price they got? The price they got was an emboldened Muslim Brotherhood. There is a majority in parliament, and that will be a problem for them. But these are not easy dilemmas for some of these countries, because you can always hear the kind of counterfactual in this case when I talk to Jordanians telling you, if you have not done that, the MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, would have gotten even more, and we might have a civil war or at least unrest on our hands. So these are kind of difficult things. In terms of the day after, creating a replacement for Hamas, what you see not only privately, but even publicly from Arab states saying, we are willing to play a role in Gaza in the day after. A big part of the motivator for that is to ensure that Hamas does not emerge as a strong actor. Yet, those countries have certain requirements to go into that. One requirement is for the Israelis to give them what they want, for the Israeli government to give them what they want, which is accepting that the Palestinian Authority will be at least the umbrella under which this works, and an idea of a credible pathway, to use the current lingo, to a Palestinian state, to a two-state solution. So Israel has to do its bit, and you know better than me Israeli politics and its complications. On the other hand, the Palestinian Authority itself is a problematic actor. How do you manage that? How do you manage its weakness and lack of credibility? But I have no doubt that given the chance, a lot of these Arab countries are willing to play a proactive, on-the-ground role to make sure that you try to create an alternative for Hamas and do not cede the space for Hamas to reconstitute.
These countries who surprise us by saying we're willing to put military force in Gaza, do you see them willing to confront Hamas, if need be, even having to fire on people involved in terrorism who are storing weapons against Israel? Isn't there this fear that they don't want to be seen as being somehow Israel's partner? How do you bring the PA along? I know this is a favorite theme of yours, the reform of the PA and the role of the Gulf states to help. If you could use the word de-radicalization, you could use the words reform, whatever it is. I'm just trying to see how far are the Arab states willing to go, because they learned something on October 7th. Hamas threatens them and their regimes. The question is, how do you contain it in a way that's effective? How do you see it?
I mean, how many hours do we have to discuss this?
Yeah, I know. That's a frown.
To be quick about it, I would say, first of all, the question of engaging in actual non-defensive use of firepower is a challenge that every external actor faces in every peacekeeping context, not only in the Palestinian-Israeli context. We see it in a global way. This is very hard for externals to engage in combat activities on the ground. And more so, as you rightly said, when the other side is Palestinians and the images are not ones that any Arab country would want to see. If we're going to have an Arab role, it will be a mix of trying to co-opt the remnants of Hamas not to fall into the de-Baathification trap that the U.S. did in Iraq, using Palestinian forces, whether they are PA-oriented or even contractors of some sort, as the first line that does the actual shooting. It will be a hybrid of all of these kind of things. It's not going to be a clean Western style, clear command and control and all that kind of stuff. So this is on the military side. I don't think that we can have an orderly vision of what it's going to look like. It's going to be messy. On the other side, I actually think, I was involved in the Palestinian reform 15 years ago. And one of the big challenges we had at that time is how to get a model of reform that is locally compatible, Arab compatible. What works in the US and in Paris and in London doesn't necessarily work in Ramallah and Gaza City. Luckily, today, there are Arab countries that do provide a homegrown model of how do you build an effective de-radicalized governance. You see it in the United Arab Emirates. You see it in Saudi Arabia. And I would like for those countries to play a major role, not only in reconstruction of Gaza, but in the reform of the Palestinian Authority and in the formulation and the establishment of whatever governance structure we're going to have in Gaza after the war. I frankly would like to see Emirati curricula being used in the Palestinian arena. And it's not, by the way, only a question of de-radicalization. It's a question of having an education system that is not premised on grievances, but rather premised on a forward-leaning, forward-looking approach. I would like to see the Saudis come and give us some of their expertise in terms of reshaping the public sector. So I think there's a role to be played for these kind of countries. But I repeat what I said. They are willing to play these roles, yet they do need the political packaging and the political cover that can only come from an Israeli decision to allow the PA to at least be the symbolic address and to recommit to the idea of a two-state solution.
Okay, Michael, so you, besides being a Hamas expert, know Israel. What is the zone of the possible? Again, I don't want to get into all the vagaries of Israeli politics, but on one hand, the Arab states willing to do more because they realize how much of a cancer Hamas is for them to do more in Gaza. Yet, as Ghaith said, feeling they need a legitimate invitation from a Palestinian partner. The prime minister says he doesn't want the PA, but are they really willing to clash with Hamas? So you have Israel not wanting to leave, yet you want the Arabs for their money and their educational curriculum, you want them in. How is this cohabitation of Israel and the Arab states in Gaza that hasn't been defeated? We all agree that you can't defeat Hamas without competing with Hamas. If there's a vacuum, if there's chaos, if it's Somalia, people will go to what they know, which is Hamas. How do you change this?
At this point, David, maybe I think this is the first gap or differences between us, because I think that I'm more skeptic about the idea of Arab states' involvement in Gaza today and in the day after. I think that right now, at least for the short term, we speak about Israeli-Hamas game. I think that maybe you can, in a very limited aspect, you can push Arab states to promote all kinds of moves. But, in the end of the day, I think that at least by now, we speak about a very few and a poor alternatives that stand in front of Israel. We must choose the least worst alternative out of them. Actually, there are two alternatives right now. One, if we really want to implement dramatic, deep change in Gaza, Israel have to occupy all Gaza, from Erez to Rafah in the south. And I think that right now there is no willingness or no capacity of Israel to promote this idea.
No appetite. Given what Defense Minister Gallant has said, that Israel doesn't want to be an occupier, doesn't want to feed 2 million people, doesn't want reservist duty 200 days a year. It's very costly, and the Israeli public wants to get out. They don't want to occupy people.
I agree, David, and this is condition number one. If you really want to undermine Hamas regime or to change, I don't like this term, to change the minds of the Palestinians and to promote de-radicalization, even if there is no internal engine or internal willingness of the Palestinians right now, at least, to promote it. And I mentioned the option of full control. The other option is the deal. I'm not naive. I do aware that the deal means full withdrawal right now from Gaza, and the end, at least by now, of this round of fighting, of escalation. But the other alternative, the third one, is ongoing attrition, war of attrition. I really don't see how all kinds of operations like the one who is being promoted right now in the northern parts of Gaza really assist Israel to defeat Hamas or to release the hostages. But for the long run, And only if there will be any kind of occupation of Israel in the future, not now. And I think that this is more likely and less likely that there will be internal revolution of the people of Gaza against Hamas. You can speak about a new order, a new reality. And at this point, I think that you can speak about the involvement of Arab states, mainly UAE, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, of course, Egypt, in order to create local administration, Palestinian one, because Israel doesn't want to control directly the Palestinians. Of course, financial and economic support, all kind of security support. I think that the idea that Arab forces, Egyptians, UAE, Saudis, will be deployed right now in Gaza, it's total illusion. I think that this is one of the fantasies that are being elaborated in the Israeli discourse, and it's not likely.
It's not likely because they know they will probably have to cohabit with Israel, and they will make them collaborators, quote unquote, and it's nothing in it for them kind of thing. But you didn't mention the PA at Wraith's point. I mean, I know the prime minister, because of his coalition, says he doesn't want to do that. But you also think if you had Netanyahu over for a martini in the middle of the night without Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and said, okay, of all these alternatives, he would probably say the PA is the best way to go. Would you say that?
Once again, I must be honest and frank enough to admit that the PA doesn't really have right now the capacity. Maybe they have the appetite, the strategic one, to rule Gaza. But right now, they barely control the West Bank. In several parts of the West Bank, in Samaria, in the northern parts of the West Bank, Jenin and Tulkarem, they do not control at all. So you cannot really rely on the assumption that they can control 2 million people who for 2 decades were educated to consider them as collaborators. So I really think that in an ideal world, the PA could be the best alternative. But right now, we cannot send them to this mission. It will be horrible.
You don't want to set them up to fail. I understand that. But do you think there is value? I want to be sure I understand your views exactly. Would you say, look, they might have the political will, and the world might see them as the legitimate force, but there's a capacity issue. In Lebanon, for example, there's a capacity issue with the Lebanese armed forces. Same thing, weak states in these places. Of course, the Palestinians are not yet a state, but weak states and strong non-state actors. Is it worthwhile for the world to say, okay, Israel's going to have to stay there a bit longer, but it's worth for us to invest in the PA's capacity? Wraith's point about the reform is crucial. But I mean, is that the right approach to say, look, they are the right address, but it's going to take time, and let's be realistic about that?
Totally. I agree with this attitude. But in the same time, and this is once again my personal opinion, I'm not sure that all those positive changes can be implemented in the days of Abu Mazen. I'm not sure that this leader can be changed. I'm quite sure that all the changes, the political, the internal, the organizational, of course, those who regarding Gaza, they will be promoted only after Abu Mazen. This is okay to speak about the PA in its even positive attitude, but we must be also realistic. We cannot rely right now on the assumption that they can do for Israel the dirty job in Gaza. It is impossible.
Would it be fair for you to say that given the alternatives, Michael, that you have presented, Israeli permanently occupied, an endless war, as you kind of put out, or Hamas basically being in control, I mean, of all the options, you have to choose one option, where would you put the emphasis? And if it isn't done to rebuild the PA, are we basically admitting that Hamas is going to come back? That's the post-Sinwar period.
And once again, David, we must admit Hamas right now exists or functions as the prominent player in Gaza. It will not return to Gaza. It is already the prominent player in Gaza. And I think that, once again, my basic or my most important consideration right now are the hostages. And I do think that if we really want to see them here in Israel, so it means that we will have to choose the painful, negative path of accepting Hamas' existence in Gaza. They are not the same regime they were a year ago. They are much weaker, and we must also think about all kinds of ways to restrict their power, and of course to think about future strategies in order to change this strategy. We cannot live with this tiger in the same room. But once again, they are not ideal or positive alternatives that we can choose. And yeah, I agree with you. In the same time, we must also speak about how to make the PA stronger. And of course, today in the Israeli politics, it's impossible to speak in such a manner. Once again, they are not our allies. They are not part of the Zionist movement. But this is the least worst partner from our point of view. And we must understand that, of course, I do not support the idea of let's consider them, the PA, as an enemy and bring them to total collapse, because the meaning will be one state between the river and the sea. And I think that this is the nightmare of the Zionist project.
So, Ghaith, I give you the final word. Given what you heard from Michael, what's the bottom line that our listeners need to take away?
3 quick points. 1, just a detail, the PA does not only suffer from a problem of capabilities, but also of credibility. And that is a major challenge that needs to be overcome. Look, I mean, when we talk about bringing back the PA, we're talking about a gradual process of phase in, phase out. And the Israelis obviously will have to continue playing a security role. I just can't see an alternative to that yet. And I will conclude with this point, and I think Michael mentioned it. I think many Israelis that I talk to at least are living in a fantasy that somehow they can say all of the no's to every proposal and yet somehow find someone will take Gaza off their hands. Israel has to face the choice that Michael presented very starkly. If you have no alternative, if you don't bring a third party, then it's either Hamas or Israel having to take control. And as Colin Powell said, you break it, you own it. And unless the Israelis start examining, and I know that many Israelis are examining this possibility and are scared of this possibility, but you might end up with the slippery slope that if you don't create an alternative, you find yourself in charge of the civilian management and the security management of the whole Gaza Strip. To just, conclude on maybe crying over some spilled milk, this is the conversation that should have been had a year ago. We had a year in which these alternatives could have been developed, strengthening the PA, pushing Abbas either out of the way or letting him cooperate, all of these kind of issues. Deferring the decision, deferring the discussion does not eliminate the problem. It only makes it more complicated.
So on that very sobering note, I want to thank both you, Michael Milshtein, and you, Ghaith al-Omari, for a very illuminating conversation about the tough choices ahead. Thank you both for joining us on Decision Points.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
We just had an insightful and sobering conversation with Ghaith al-Omari and Dr. Michael Milshtein. We discussed the growing concern over the power vacuum left by Sinwar's death, and the question of who will replace him, if anyone. This looms large. There's a profound sense that without a strategic plan for who will govern Gaza, Hamas, even in a militarily weakened state, will continue to play the de facto power. The reality is clear. You can't defeat Hamas unless you compete with Hamas. It's imperative that there's a comprehensive strategy in place to address this, whether through the engagement of Arab states in a multilateral coalition or through the gradual phasing in of the Palestinian Authority. Without a clear vision for Gaza's future, Hamas risks enduring in some form, leaving both the region and Israel trapped in a cycle of instability. Only a strong, coordinated approach will ensure that Gaza and its people can move beyond Hamas's grip. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gabbert, Simone Seidmeyer, Sidney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like yourselves for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on WhatsApp, X, or a variety of social media platforms, I invite you to share this show with your friends. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.